The night sky above the Polish-Belarusian border was supposed to be quiet. Farmers had finished their work, villages slept in silence, and soldiers on patrol carried out their routine watches in the bitter cold. Then, without warning, the horizon erupted in fire. Explosions thundered across the countryside, tearing through a supply depot on the Polish side of the border. Shockwaves rattled windows for miles, and a column of flames lit the darkness. Sirens screamed through small towns, people stumbled from their homes, and within minutes, the first images appeared on social media. A NATO country had just been struck. At first, no one understood what had happened. Some thought it was an accident, others whispered about terrorism, but the truth was soon confirmed. Missiles or artillery shells had crossed the border, landing deep enough inside Poland that there could be no doubt. This was no mistake of geography. Soldiers rushed to the scene, pulling the wounded from burning trucks, shouting over the roar of secondary explosions as munitions ignited one by one. For those on the ground, it felt like the beginning of something far worse. Tank crews started their engines, fighter pilots scrambled from their bunks, and radar stations went to full alert. The strike was not just a local incident. It was the nightmare NATO planners had warned about for years. The line between peace and war had been crossed. In Warsaw, red lights lit up in the National Defense Headquarters. Within minutes, the Polish government declared a national emergency. Reports confirmed at least a dozen casualties, both military and civilian. Panic spread through border villages as families packed cars and tried to flee westward, fearing more attacks would come by dawn. The Polish military did not wait for explanations. Convoys of armored vehicles roared toward the border, headlights cutting through the darkness. Anti-aircraft batteries deployed along highways, their missile tubes aimed at the sky. In the air, F-16s climbed into combat patrols, engines howling as they streaked eastward. The order was clear. No further violations would be tolerated. But the situation was far more dangerous than a single strike. Intelligence reports began to flow into NATO headquarters. Satellites had tracked unusual troop movements on the Belarusian side. Armored columns, artillery batteries, and mobile missile launchers were on the move. To many in Brussels, it looked less like an isolated attack and more like preparation for escalation. By morning, the incident dominated global headlines. Television screens showed blazing wreckage, smoke pouring into the sky, and ambulances racing down country roads. Anchors repeated the same words. A NATO member had been struck. The alliance faced a decision that could change the course of history. The people of Poland already knew what that meant. In border towns, school gymnasiums were converted into makeshift shelters. Families huddled together, clutching bags of clothes and passports, waiting for buses to carry them farther inland. On the roads, endless lines of vehicles stretched west, headlights glowing like rivers of light. Soldiers stood guard at intersections, rifles slung across their chests, their faces grim. For NATO commanders, the clock was ticking. Was this a deliberate Russian provocation, a test of Western resolve, or a rogue strike that had gone too far? The answer mattered less than the fact itself. The border had been crossed, lives had been lost, and the world was waiting for the response. In the skies above Eastern Europe, American reconnaissance planes began circling, their sensors fixed on Belarus. Electronic warfare aircraft swept the spectrum, listening for signals of further launches. In Germany, U.S. armored brigades began preparing for rapid deployment eastward. Across Europe, the quiet of peacetime had ended. What had begun as a flash in the night was already transforming into the most dangerous crisis the continent had seen in generations. Soldiers at the border gripped their rifles, listening to distant engines across the tree line. Commanders issued clipped orders into radios, voices tense but steady. Civilians watched the skies, each thunderclap of a jet engine sending chills through their bodies. The strike on Poland had lasted only minutes, but its consequences would echo through history. The line between warning and war had blurred. and Europe now stood one miscalculation away from catastrophe. In Brussels, the silence of the night was shattered by urgent phone calls and flashing monitors. NATO headquarters filled with generals, diplomats, and intelligence officers, each carrying fragments of information that together painted a grim picture. The strike on Poland was undeniable, the casualties confirmed, and the pressure for a response overwhelming. The first step was consultation. Article 4 of the NATO treaty was triggered, bringing member states into immediate discussion. Around the table, voices rose with anger, fear, and determination. The Polish delegation spoke with fire in their eyes, demanding that the alliance treat the attack as a violation of its core principles. "We cannot afford hesitation," one Polish officer warned. "Every minute we delay sends a message of weakness." Others urged caution. Was the strike deliberate? Could it have been a misfire, a technical failure, or the result of rogue elements? Invoking Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, meant war not just for Poland, but for every nation in the alliance. The weight of that decision pressed down on the room like a stone. Outside the meeting chambers, NATO's military machine was already in motion. In Germany, columns of American Abrams tanks rolled onto highways, their engines growling as they headed east. In the skies, formations of Eurofighter Typhoons and American F-35s roared from bases in Italy, the UK, and the Netherlands, heading toward patrol zones along the frontier. 1,000 small preparations signaled the same reality. NATO was bracing for the worst. In the streets of Brussels, the gravity of the situation spread quickly. News networks broadcast live images of military convoys, maps of the Polish border, and urgent updates about troop movements in Belarus. Ordinary Europeans who had lived for decades in the peace of a united continent now found themselves staring at headlines about missiles, tanks, and potential war with Russia. Back in Warsaw, the Polish Prime Minister addressed the nation. His words were steady but grim. "Poland has been attacked. We mourn the lives lost, and we will not stand alone. NATO stands with us, and together we will defend every inch of our territory." His speech was carried live across Europe, echoing in languages from Lisbon to Vilnius. For many, it was a chilling reminder of older wars that had once torn the continent apart. As night turned to morning, the situation grew even more tense. Satellite imagery confirmed new deployments of Russian and Belarusian forces near the border. Armored brigades were massing in the forests, mobile missile batteries shifting position every few hours to evade detection. Command centers deep inside Moscow and Minsk glowed with activity, as officers tracked NATO's own buildup with equal intensity. In the Pentagon, American generals watched the situation unfold with cold calculation. The president was briefed every hour. His advisors split between hawks urging immediate retaliation and doves pleading for restraint. One camp argued that failure to act decisively would embolden Moscow further, while the other warned that a single strike back could ignite a chain reaction spiraling beyond control. For the soldiers in the field, these debates were distant. Along the border, Polish and American troops dug in, laying camouflage nets, preparing artillery positions, and scanning the tree line with night vision scopes. Each soldier knew that if another missile fell, if another explosion tore through Polish soil, they might be the first to fire in the next European war. The air was thick with anticipation. Fighter jets thundered overhead, leaving vapor trails against the pale sky. Convoys of armored personnel carriers rattled down narrow village roads past farmers who stood in silence at their gates, watching history unfold once again on their soil. In Brussels, after hours of debate, no final decision was made. The alliance agreed only on one thing: they would not back down. Whether the strike was deliberate or accidental, the message from NATO was clear. The next attack would be met with force. Europe had entered a new phase, a place where diplomacy balanced on the edge of a knife, and armies stood ready within minutes to move from defense to war. The border strike in Poland was no longer an isolated incident. It was the opening move in a confrontation that could engulf the entire continent. In Moscow, the Kremlin moved quickly to seize control of the story. Within hours of the explosions on Polish soil, state television carried official statements from the Ministry of Defense. The message was simple and repeated endlessly. Russia denied responsibility. The strike, they claimed, was either a fabrication or a provocation staged by NATO itself to justify further expansion of troops along the border. On the surface, the denials were calm, but behind them, the movements of the Russian military told a very different story. Intelligence satellites captured images of armored brigades mobilizing inside Belarus, their columns stretching for kilometers along forested highways. Mobile missile launchers, concealed beneath camouflage nets, shifted positions in the dead of night. Railway yards filled with flatbeds carrying tanks and self-propelled artillery, moving westward with grim purpose. Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, bristled with new activity. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the telltale shapes of Iskander ballistic missile systems being deployed in open fields. The range of those weapons covered nearly every major NATO base in Eastern Europe. Surface-to-air batteries, including the powerful S-400 Triumph system, were placed on high alert, their radars sweeping the skies relentlessly. Russian media painted a very different picture. Anchors told viewers that NATO forces were the aggressors, that Polish troops had shelled their own depot, that the West was fabricating evidence to create a crisis. They showed footage of Russian families stocking groceries, of young conscripts boarding buses with forced smiles, of parades meant to project strength. The reality was clear. Russia was preparing its people for escalation, while denying it was doing so. Inside Belarus, the signs were even harder to ignore. At air bases near Baranovichi and Lida, Su-35 fighter jets stood fueled and armed on the runways, their pilots sleeping in flight suits for immediate scramble. In the forests near Brest, drone footage revealed temporary camps, fresh trenches, armored personnel carriers covered in tarpaulins, soldiers digging in under frosted earth. NATO intelligence reports poured in hourly, each more alarming than the last. Analysts noted that the pattern of Russian movements matched known invasion rehearsals. Fuel depots were being stocked. Field hospitals were established within striking distance of the border. And perhaps most concerning, strategic bombers were being repositioned to bases within range of Central Europe. For the West, the signals were unmistakable. Whatever Moscow claimed publicly, its military posture suggested readiness for something far larger than a border skirmish. The line between denial and deception had blurred. On the ground, the standoff grew sharper. Polish troops along the frontier stared through binoculars at Belarusian positions less than a mile away. They could see tank turrets glinting in the cold sun, hear the rumble of engines idling across the tree line. Between them lay a no-man's land of frozen fields, where silence was more frightening than the sound of fire. One Polish soldier later wrote in his diary that it was like watching a storm gather on the horizon. You could see the clouds, feel the air change, and yet no rain had fallen. Not yet. The waiting was the worst. For Russian conscripts on the other side, the fear was just as real. Many were young, barely trained, pulled from small towns, and thrust into uniforms with rifles they barely knew how to use. They wrote letters home, promising their mothers they would return soon. But in their eyes lingered the uncertainty of pawns, pushed forward on a chessboard too vast for them to understand. The world watched with growing dread. The denials from Moscow might have soothed domestic audiences, but outside Russia, no one was convinced. NATO analysts saw the pattern. Historians remembered the lessons of past conflicts, and civilians across Europe whispered the same question. How much longer could the fragile calm hold before a single shot unleashed a storm? The focus of the crisis soon shifted north. to a narrow stretch of land that military planners had feared for decades. The Suwałki Gap, a 60-mile corridor between Poland and Lithuania, was suddenly alive with movement. On maps, it looked insignificant, a thin strip of fields, forests, and small villages. But for NATO strategists, it was the Achilles heel of the alliance. If Russian forces from Kaliningrad linked up with units in Belarus, the corridor would be sealed, cutting the Baltic states off from the rest of Europe. Reports from reconnaissance drones confirmed it. Heavy Russian armor was moving closer to the border, columns of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles edging toward the gap. Belarusian units reinforced their positions with artillery, while combat engineers laid down pontoon bridges across frozen rivers. Every indication pointed toward preparation for a strike that could strangle NATO's northeastern flank. Polish and Lithuanian forces scrambled to respond. Leopard 2 tanks rolled into defensive lines, their tracks tearing the frozen soil as they took up firing positions overlooking highways. Soldiers dug fighting trenches, erected camouflage nets, and laid mines along likely approaches. Lithuanian reserves were mobilized, citizens lining up at distribution centers to receive rifles and ammunition. The quiet villages of the Gap transformed overnight into fortified positions, braced for an assault that might never come, or might come at any hour. The skies above the corridor became a battlefield of nerves. American F-35s patrolled alongside Polish MiG-29s, their pilots reporting aggressive maneuvers from Russian Su-35 fighters, crossing dangerously close to their flight paths. On one tense afternoon, a Russian jet cut across the nose of a NATO reconnaissance plane, forcing it into a sharp dive. For a brief, terrifying moment, radar operators prepared to declare a hostile act. Fingers tightened on triggers, commanders shouted into radios, and the world held its breath. Then, just as suddenly, the Russian jet peeled away. But the incident left no illusions. Both sides were now operating at hair-trigger readiness. One miscalculation in the skies or on the ground could ignite a conflict far beyond the narrow fields of the Suwałki Gap. NATO's buildup intensified. From Germany and the Netherlands, convoys of armored vehicles thundered eastward on highways, escorted by helicopters. U.S. paratroopers were flown into air bases in Poland, their equipment pre-positioned for immediate deployment. French and British artillery units joined the defensive lines, their long-range guns pointed east. The message was unmistakable. If Russia tried to close the gap, NATO would fight. Civilians in the region lived with the constant hum of engines and the distant thunder of drills. Families evacuated villages closest to the frontier, their possessions piled high in cars as they drove west. Schools closed, churches opened their basements as shelters, and supermarkets emptied in hours. In the eyes of the people, the crisis was no longer abstract. It was pressing in on their homes. Meanwhile, intelligence reports added to the unease. Satellite imagery showed movement of tactical nuclear warheads inside Belarus. Long convoys of trucks, under heavy guard, tracked by Western analysts, suggested weapons capable of obliterating entire brigades were being deployed within striking distance of the border. No official announcement came, but the message was clear. Russia was signaling that escalation would not remain conventional for long. In NATO headquarters, commanders confronted the grim reality. If Russia moved on the Suwałki Gap, it would not be a limited skirmish. It would be an assault on the alliance itself, forcing every member to act. That meant American forces from across the Atlantic, German and French divisions, even smaller nations like Norway and Denmark, all drawn into a war few had ever thought possible again on European soil. The corridor, once a quiet passage of farms and villages, now stood as the most dangerous stretch of land in the world. Soldiers on both sides stared across the fields, listening for the first shot. And everywhere, the same thought hung heavy in the air. If this gap closed, Europe would descend into war. Tension that had once been measured in hours was now counted in minutes. Along the Polish-Belarusian frontier and the Suwałki Gap, every soldier, every pilot, every commander knew that one misstep would ignite the largest conflict Europe had seen since 1945. The first spark nearly came at dusk. A Russian artillery battery positioned near Brest opened fire, shells landing dangerously close to a Polish border outpost. For 15 seconds, Polish gunners believed they were under direct attack. Their fingers hovered over the triggers, ready to unleash a counter-barrage. Radio channels exploded with frantic orders to hold fire. Then, the shelling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Later, Moscow claimed it was a training exercise. For NATO, it was proof of how close the edge had become. In the skies, the near misses grew bolder. A Russian Su-27 fighter locked its radar onto a NATO patrol jet for nearly 30 seconds, long enough for missile warning alarms to scream inside the cockpit, long enough for NATO pilots to arm their weapons. Only after frantic calls from ground controllers did the Russian jet disengage. In Brussels, analysts called it a brush with catastrophe. But the most chilling signals came from intelligence reports. Satellite imagery revealed convoys of specialized trucks moving under heavy guard into Belarusian forests. Analysts confirmed what many feared. Tactical nuclear warheads were being deployed to forward positions. Short-range missiles, capable of striking Warsaw, Vilnius, or Riga in minutes, now stood ready for launch. Across Europe, governments went to their highest states of alert. Germany recalled reservists. Britain ordered its nuclear submarines to sea. The United States raised its forces to DEFCON 3, the same readiness level used during the Gulf War, with bombers placed on continuous patrol over the Atlantic. In Moscow, President Putin appeared on national television, surrounded by generals. His words were defiant. Russia, he declared, would not be intimidated. Any attack on Belarus or Russian forces would be treated as an attack on the homeland itself. Behind his words, the implication was unmistakable. Nuclear escalation was on the table. In Warsaw, the Polish Prime Minister addressed the nation for the second time in a week. His speech was solemn, almost resigned. Poland, he said, would not bend, and NATO would stand as one. His final words echoed across the continent. If the line is crossed again, the response will be immediate. Civilians across Eastern Europe braced for the worst. Families filled underground shelters, radios tuned constantly to emergency broadcasts. In towns near the frontier, streets emptied, shops shuttered, and the silence of abandonment spread. Yet in that silence, the rumble of tanks and the roar of jets never stopped. For the soldiers on both sides, life became a blur of drills and waiting. American paratroopers slept with their weapons at hand. Russian conscripts sat in freezing trenches, watching through night vision scopes as NATO armor shifted in the distance. Each side knew the other was just as exhausted, just as afraid, and just as ready to act if ordered. Then came the intelligence that froze hearts in every command center. Reconnaissance aircraft detected the fueling of Iskander missile systems in Kaliningrad. At the same time, NATO radars tracked Russian bombers lifting off from inland bases, circling in holding patterns just outside Allied airspace. The pieces were in place. All that was missing was a single command. The world stood still. In Brussels, Washington, Moscow, and every capital in Europe, leaders understood the gravity. One launch, one explosion on the wrong side of the border, and the spiral would be unstoppable. For hours, the standoff stretched on, unbearable in its silence. Commanders stared at screens, diplomats clutched phones, and civilians whispered prayers. The question was no longer if the next strike would come, but when. And in that silence, Europe held its breath, waiting to discover whether the border strike that began this crisis would become the spark that set the entire world ablaze. Europe had not stood this close to the edge in generations. What began with explosions on a quiet night in Poland had transformed into a confrontation, stretching from the forests of Belarus to the skies above the Baltic Sea. Armies faced each other at gunpoint, missiles sat fueled and waiting, and the faintest spark threatened to ignite a firestorm. For the leaders in Brussels, Washington, and Moscow, the choices narrowed with every hour. To act meant risking catastrophe. To hesitate meant inviting further strikes. There was no path that did not lead through danger. Civilians across the continent lived in a suspended world. Streets quiet, shelves emptied, shelters crowded. Memories of older wars returned in whispers, in the worried eyes of parents, in the fear of children asking if bombs would fall. And yet, despite the readiness, despite the mobilization, no shot had yet been fired in retaliation. The silence was heavy, but it was a silence filled with unbearable tension. Every commander, every soldier, every diplomat knew the truth. One launch, one shell, one wrong decision could transform Europe overnight into the battlefield of the 21st century. History stood on a knife's edge. Whether the future would be decided by restraint or by fire was a question no one could yet answer. What was certain was this: after the strike on Poland, the world would never look at peace in Europe the same way again.